Hi everyone, I'm Vicki Zakshevsky, the Education Director at the Greater Good Science Center and also one of the facilitators at the Summer Institute for Educators. In this first webinar, we're going to be covering the field of social emotional learning, or what is commonly known as SEL. So go ahead and take a look at some of the key topics for our webinar. I do want to mention that SEL is the common term used in pre-K through 12 settings in the United States. Other countries often use other terms, which I'll talk about later. And for our higher education participants, SEL is often referred to as life skills or relaxation courses, social skills, a number of other terms. Yale and Harvard, of course, have their wildly popular courses on happiness. And sometimes these classes teach social emotional skills, sometimes not. The content for the happiness classes comes from the positive psychology field, which doesn't overlap a whole lot with SEL, but here and there can be some crossover. So in this webinar, wherever I can, I separate out SEL in pre-K through 12 from SEL in higher education. However, much of what is happening with SEL in the pre-K through 12 field is very relevant to higher ed. So SEL is actually a fairly recent phenomenon in the field of education, but that's not really that surprising because it's fairly new to research as well. Dr. Richard Davidson, who's pictured here, a leading researcher in the science of emotions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, tells the history of emotion research in his book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, which if you have not read, I highly, highly recommend it. He says that until the early 1970s, scientists were focused on cognitive development only. For instance, how we perceive, how we remember things, how we solve problems, how we talk, that sort of thing. Emotions were considered disruptive. He writes in his book, the idea that emotions might be beneficial or have any function other than interrupting behavior was antithetical to the idea of emotions as mental distractions and disruptions. Thankfully, he ignored all of this and plunged into the new science of emotions anyway, and now thanks to him and many other researchers, we know that emotions are integral to how we navigate the world, how we learn, our relationships, our success in the workplace, our life satisfaction. In fact, we now know that cognition and emotions go hand in hand. So moving on to the field of education, education itself didn't really pay much attention to emotions either until recently. Instead, as Linda Lantieri, who's pictured here, one of the founders of the SEL field, described to me, she said in the late 80s and the early 90s, there were curricular programs that were being created to fix the ills of society, things such as violence, drugs, suicide, truancy, dropping out, smoking, teen pregnancy. But these programs didn't teach students how to handle the difficult emotions and social situations that often lead students to engage in risky behavior in the first place. Instead, they taught students about the negative outcomes of these behaviors and that they just shouldn't do it. So a perfect example is the Just Say No to Drugs project that I'm sure many of us can remember. And Linda described this as a deficit model approach, one that focuses on the negative rather than building on students' strengths and cultivating the inner tools and resources to live a healthy life, which is something that SEL does. So Linda went on to tell me that in 1995, Dan Goleman published his wildly popular bestseller, Emotional Intelligence, based on research by Peter Salovey and John Mayer, which brought to society's attention the need for us to pay attention to our emotions. And here on the slide, I've given Dan's definition of emotional intelligence. And then at the same time as the book was being published, Linda, Dan, and a handful of others founded the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL as it's commonly known, which now serves as an umbrella organization for the field of SEL. And CASEL's mission focuses on SEL research, practice, and policy in preschool through high school. So for example, they don't actually provide SEL curricula or trainings, but they do vet the research and they provide a list of evidence-based programs for schools to choose from. They also work at the state and federal level in the United States to make sure that, to get make SEL part of educational policy. In addition, they work with large partner districts such as Austin, Anchorage, Atlanta, Oakland, and a few others to implement SEL throughout the district. To find out more about what they do and what they offer, I've included the link to their website on this slide. So CASEL provides a basic model and definition of SEL that many in the field of education use as a foundation to their work, and I've shown both the model and the definition here on the slide. I want to point out there are literally hundreds of frameworks out there that cover social emotional development that also may include things like character or resilience or positive youth development or cognitive skills. There are just so many frameworks that literally can drive an educator crazy trying to figure them all out. However, CASEL really is the leader in the field, so we're going to focus on this framework for this webinar. Another point that I want to make is that researchers who are diving into these frameworks, trying to make sense out of all of them and see where they overlap with each other and don't, they're discovering that most actually do not directly address culturally or linguistically diverse students or students with disabilities. And the research is showing this is a major limitation to these frameworks, including CASEL's. However, the field is growing more aware of these limitations and slowly but surely beginning to make some progress in these areas, including CASEL. However, right now, it really is up to educators to make sure that whatever framework their school uses, that it's relevant and appropriate to their students. So as you can see here, the 5 competencies in CASEL's model include 2 focused on the individual, which are self-awareness and self-management, 2 focused on others, social awareness and relationship skills, and then 1 that puts all of this into action, responsible decision-making. More recently, CASEL has added to their model to show how these basic 5 competencies need to be integrated into all areas of a school, including classrooms, academic content, school practices and policies such as discipline, school climate, the collegial relationships between the adults, homes, and communities. What also is important to note is that SEL focuses on the development of skills, which from a research point of view has theoretically made the field easier to study than the field of character education, something we'll talk more about in the 3rd webinar. So let's go ahead and dig into the 5 competencies and see what it means to put these in action, starting with self-awareness. So here is a very basic definition of self-awareness along with some of the key skills. Feel free to hit pause and read the slide on your own. I'm not going to read through these bullet points. So what might a self-awareness lesson look like in the classroom? For younger students, a self-awareness lesson might involve making a list of how anger feels on the inside of our bodies and how it looks when we express it. For older students, it might be developed through small group discussion about the values displayed by a literary character and how this relates or doesn't relate to students' personal values. So then here is the definition of self-management and some key skills. Again, feel free to hit pause and read through the slide on your own. Some sample self-management lessons for younger students. It might focus on learning to express anger in a culturally relevant and healthy way. For older students, self-management might include creating long-term goals that benefit not just oneself, but also the world beyond the self. And here is the definition of social awareness along with some key skills. And again, feel free to hit pause and read through that. Some sample social awareness lessons for younger students. It might focus on students identifying ways in which they are different from each other and then celebrating those differences. For older students, you might have them watch Cleveland Clinic's amazing videos on empathy, which I've included the links here, and then have them make a video on empathy for their school. This was actually an idea that came up in the one of the summer institutes, and I don't know if anyone has actually done it, but I think it's a really fantastic idea. So here is the definition of relationship skills along with some of those key skills as well. Again, feel free to hit pause and read it on your own. And some sample relationship skills lessons for younger students. It might include how to deal with peer exclusion. And for older students, a developmentally appropriate way to teach social skills might be in the context of community service, thus linking the skill to something that's relevant to them in their lives that helps make the world a better place. And then here's the definition, finally, of responsible decision-making and some of those skills that fall under that category. Some sample responsible decision-making lessons for younger students might be generating a list of possible solutions to a problem. For older students, maybe they might develop their ethical thinking skills by debating whether or not it's the government's responsibility to pay for citizens' health care. Again, an idea that was generated in a summer institute. So many schools and districts start with Castle's model, but then they make changes and additions to adapt to their specific needs or outcomes. So for example here, Sacramento City Unified School District added growth mindset as one of their competencies. And then here another example, Oakland Unified School District, they added the bolded italicized language to their definition of SEL to fit the context of their schools. And I'll go ahead and let you just pause and read that on your own. One very important adaptation of the Castle framework is this one that was put together by the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child. It's an organization that's focused on getting SEL training into teacher education programs. I'm not going to go over this framework during the webinar, but we will address it during the Institute itself. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention because this is really where the SEL field is going next. And if you want more information about this, click on the hyperlink on the slide. What's really, really exciting to see is how social emotional learning is happening in all parts of the world. It's just exploding everywhere, and it's just so wonderful. And there's no way I can cover all the initiatives in this webinar, but I just wanted to mention a few. So in Europe, there's a group called the European Network for Social and Emotional Competence that is made up of European academics. And they define what they call social emotional education as including Castle's definition, but also including positive psychology, positive education, resilience, and mindfulness. They also place greater emphasis on the social self, including caring and inclusion. And some of their activities are things like conferences, publishing white papers and newsletters in effort to spread social emotional education. And if you want to know more, I highly recommend the white paper that I've hyperlinked on this slide. And on page 39, the report lists what different EU countries are calling SEL. In the Middle East, both the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait have very strong initiatives around implementing positive psychology into schools. Again, positive psychology is not SEL, but both can contain elements of the other. And in fact, we are incredibly fortunate to have a group of teachers from Kuwait attending the second Summer Institute session this year. And so we'll be able to hear more about their amazing work that they're doing. There's also tons of work going on in Australia and Singapore, the UK and India, and just so many countries. I don't have the time to cover everything here, but if you're interested in knowing more, I encourage you to look at the reports from Fondation Botin. I apologize if I mispronounced that. The report looks at how SEL is happening in a number of different countries. It also talks about the issues that these countries are facing, and many of them are very, very similar to what we're facing in the United States. Those of you who are coming to the Institute from outside the US, we always love to hear about the work that's being done in your country. It really is one of the highlights of the Institute. So moving on to the research-based benefits of SEL, again, you're welcome to press pause and read through the slide. The field of SEL is very well researched with plenty of evidence to show that it works, but with a few caveats, of course, and I'll get to those in a minute. And then in a 2017, a meta-analysis was published that looked at 82 different interventions involving 97,000 students from kindergarten through high school. And the impact of the interventions ranged from about 6 months to 18 years after the program ended, and 38 of the studies were from the outside. Again, I'm not going to read through these findings, so feel free to press pause and read the slide on your own. So just to mention some other findings besides the outcomes mentioned. In a 2017 report, school principals say SEL is essential and would actually help them build a positive school climate, improve the relationships between teachers and students, and decrease bullying. But they really need training for teachers, and they need access to research-based strategies. In another report published in 2013 that was commissioned by Castle, they found that 93% of teachers in the United States wanted greater focus on SEL in schools. And it is pretty amazing. In the last couple of years, this field has just exploded. So this is actually happening. And then finally, a 2013 survey of 704 employers said they just couldn't find the people. They couldn't find employees. They said candidates had technical skills, but they needed social skills and decision-making and problem-solving skills. So just pointing to the importance of SEL. Now we're going to take a quick look at SEL in higher education. So just like pre-K through 12 students, higher ed students can really benefit from SEL. Research with this group shows that stress and mental health challenges are very, very high. These are statistics from an American College Health Association survey that's done every couple of years, and this is their most recent one, published in 2016. And it just shows these horrible statistics of college students experiencing high rates of depression, anxiety, hopelessness, overwhelmed by all they had to do, feeling lonely, considering suicide, self-injuring. These statistics are really just too high. However, research has also found that social emotional competencies are associated with positive academic outcomes, including grades and retention in higher education. And those higher ed students who scored high in self-awareness and self-perception have been found to adjust the most successfully to higher education settings, whereas poor self-management leads to higher depression, anxiety, and stress levels. So much of higher ed is about adapting to the new college environment. Students find themselves without the guidance of parents or a formalized school schedule. They also have to deal with roommates and faculty and new peers. And all of these new challenges require social and emotional skills. So as those of you who work in higher ed probably already know, there is no organization like CASEL or organizing framework like CASEL's 5 competencies for higher education. However, there is quite a bit of work actually happening in higher education that targets social emotional competencies. In a book called The Handbook of Social Emotional Learning, Colleen Conley from Loyola University Chicago provides an overview of this work, along with what works and what doesn't work based on the research findings. And she starts by listing 6 different types of interventions that are happening in higher ed. The first are psychoeducational programs. These programs are didactic, providing information on topics such as stress, coping, ways to relax, but they don't provide skills. The next are cognitive behavioral interventions. These focus on learning how to monitor but also change one's thoughts in order to change one's emotional and behavioral reactions to situations. So really that connection between thoughts, behavior, and feelings. Next are meditation interventions. These often focus on teaching students to focus their mind on one thing, maybe their breath, a sound, a part of the body. Fourth are mindfulness interventions. I'm not going to go into detail about this since the second webinar covers this topic. Fifth are relaxation interventions that teach progressive muscle relaxation, visualization, breathing techniques, and then finally social skills training in assertiveness, communication, and conflict resolution. So, which ones of these actually worked based on Conley's strict research criteria? Only mindfulness. These programs had manuals to guide teaching. They also focused on didactic teaching of practice and also an experiential element in which students practice skills both in and outside of the class. And students could also see how mindfulness applied to many different aspects of life. What she found was promising was cognitive behavioral interventions, relaxation, and social skills interventions. What did not work were psychoeducational programs and meditation programs, along with interventions that did not have supervised skill practice. So her takeaway was that supervised skill practice is absolutely key. You can talk about stress reduction all you want, but without actual skills, without actual practice of the skills during the class, the intervention is most likely going to fail. All right, so what does SEL look like in the classroom? And this applies to both pre-K through 12 and higher ed. So starting with standalone lessons, this is the usual way that people think about SEL. Oftentimes it might be a 30-minute lesson taught once a week on a specific SEL skill, such as emotion recognition, conflict resolution, setting goals. And these kinds of standalone lessons are particularly difficult to do as students get into middle and high school, and also at the college and university level. And so what SEL experts have now realized is that SEL needs to be integrated into every aspect of school, which can actually make it somewhat easier for educators of older students. So, for example, making discipline student-centered rather than punitive. Restorative justice is an example of this, as is the circles work, which we'll do at the Institute. Also, how teachers and professors relate to their students. Research on the teacher-student relationship at the college level shows that how professors interact with students is critical. Students want professors to be open, available, engaging. Also making our teaching culturally responsive. Are we taking into consideration the backgrounds of our students and how and what we teach? And giving students responsibility and choice, especially at the higher levels of education, is absolutely critical. Our pedagogical methods can also include SEL practices, student discussion, teaching students to be self-reflective. There's really, really wonderful work that's being done at the college level in self-reflection that can be adapted for younger students, and we'll go over this at the Institute as well. Also, making the work meaningful and relevant to students' lives and having high expectations. Cooperative groups are important at every level, but especially as students enter teen and emerging adult stages. Research suggests that standalone SEL lessons actually don't work well for this age group. So, for example, discrete lessons on reading and managing emotions or role-playing conflict resolution situations. These are kinds of lessons you would typically find in the K-6 classrooms. They don't actually go over that well with older students. Instead, skills are better taught when students' developmental needs are taken into consideration. And again, we'll go over this at the Institute in terms of what that actually looks like. So I'm sure many of you, not most of you, are already doing a lot of these things. So again, SEL is not necessarily something that's super new, but it's just a matter of identifying what is it that we're already doing. So as I mentioned in the research section, there are a few caveats to implementing SEL programs effectively, and these are some of them. As you can see from this list, again, there's a lot more to SEL than just a 30-minute lesson once a week. I'm not going to read each item on the list. If you want more information, I encourage you to read the report hyperlinked at the bottom of the page, but just to point out some of the most important bullets here. So, supportive context. School and college leaders need to cultivate a school climate in which SEL is encouraged and lived. So leaders as well as teachers need to really walk the talk of SEL. Also, building adult competencies, partnering with families, and extending SEL beyond the classroom are critically important. For those of you who'd like examples of how CASEL is implementing SEL in districts, I highly recommend you check out their district resource center linked here on the slide. This has actual documents like interview questions for potential teacher candidates, mission statements of schools and districts, professional development slides, and a lot more that they've been gathering from their collaborating districts program that have been working on implementing SEL for years. So here are some sample social emotional learning programs. Here's pre-K through 12. This is from the CASEL preschool, elementary, middle, and high school guides, which I've hyperlinked on the slide. Being on the CASEL list means that they've been tested for effectiveness through a randomized controlled trial, which is the gold standard of research. So it's actually fairly difficult to get onto CASEL's list. I am fairly familiar with all of these pre-K through 12 programs, and I just wanted to point out a few things I've noticed about them. What was kind of surprising to me, but I think really important to know, is that many do not actually cover all of CASEL's 5 competencies. If you'd like an in-depth look at what specific skills 25 of these programs do cover, I recommend looking at Harvard's report called Navigating SEL from the Inside Out, which I have hyperlinked here. Also, some of the programs claim that they're culturally responsive. I've listed those that do here on this slide. We will talk more about SEL and cultural responsiveness at the actual institute, but I would really recommend that you look very, very closely at how these programs claim to be culturally responsive and decide whether or not you think their approach is sufficient for your school's needs. Also, the programs use different pedagogical methods, so it's really important that teachers have a say in choosing a program. And most of the programs are classroom-based. Only Ruler requires that all the adults in the school be trained in the SEL skills, which is preferable. And then at the university level, again, most SEL is taught through those classes that I mentioned in a previous slide. And I haven't listed it here, but at least 1 or 2 universities that have sent people to the Summer Institute have actually implemented practices from our Greater Good in Action site to teach SEL skills. And I think one of them is actually even publishing an article on what the impact was. And we'll talk more about that at the Summer Institute as well. So, I'm going to review some challenges and current trends in the field because, you know, our understanding of human social emotional development is really growing by leaps and bounds. And as a result, the field of SEL is expanding and evolving at a very rapid rate. And all of us who are in this field are having a very hard time trying to keep up with everything. It's moving and it's growing and it's changing. But I did want to point out some of the challenges and current trends. So one, as I've mentioned before, is culturally responsive SEL. And again, we'll talk more about this at the Institute. And it's not just about SEL, but also mindfulness and character education. But I do want to point out that SEL curricula was created by the white dominant culture in the United States. So it promotes the skills, attitudes, and values of that culture. And this is actually a huge limitation of the curricula. I asked one of the CASEL founders whether any of the SEL programs on CASEL's list were starting to edit their programs to address this, and she said not that she knew of, but that it definitely needed to be done. SEL and equity. This is one of the biggest challenges faced by the SEL field right now, and it is actually working very hard to address it. Oftentimes SEL has been used as a compliance tool for students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds or as an anger management strategy in order to mask the strong emotions that result from being faced with racism, prejudice, and economic inequality on a daily basis. So, which neither of these, of course, is the correct way to use SEL. And at the Institute, we will go more in depth about SEL and equity and how we can make sure we use an equity lens with SEL. And in preparation for the Institute, those of you who are coming from outside the United States, I really invite you to consider which students in your country may come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, or who may be emigrated from another country, or perhaps as a refugee, or who traditionally may be seen as a lower status in comparison to the country's dominant culture, because this will be very, very relevant to all of those students and to the dominant culture as well. So the purpose of SEL, while there isn't a lot of public controversy around this topic, but people do still question the reasons for doing SEL. So for example, in the EU report mentioned on slide 20, the authors mention a 2015 OECD SEL report that wrote, SEL reflects a lifelong learning, market economy, and socioeconomic outcomes approach to SEL, in contrast to a broader, more holistic conception of what it is to be a flourishing human being within a social Europe, and the promotion of active citizenship, diversity, equity, and social justice. So, in other words, is SEL being used to create better workers who maintain the status quo of society, a souped-up version of the industrial model of education that continues to perpetuate the inequality within our society, or do we do SEL because we really do care about creating human beings who are able to create flourishing lives for themselves and create a more equitable society? So another hot topic these days is assessment and SEL. And measuring SEL is actually very difficult. Most SEL research focuses on outcomes rather than whether students have actually learned the skills, which is something that is really, really hard to measure for a number of reasons. However, there is a group of scientists and practitioners who are working on how to better assess SEL, going beyond just the outcomes. So if you're interested in learning more or actually being a part of this assessment work group, because they're always asking for people to join, I've included the link here that will connect you to them. Also, there is a dearth of SEL curricula for middle school, high school, and college students. Not just because there's very little time to fit in standalone lessons, but also because researchers are finding that it's more developmentally appropriate to integrate SEL skills into curriculum and projects rather than to teach discrete skills. And again, we'll talk more about this at the Institute. The developmental aspect of SEL, knowing what students should be able to do socially and emotionally by what age, is not totally understood or promoted by many SEL frameworks, standards, or programs, or research for that matter, especially because social emotional development is a lifelong process. We never stop learning how to work with our emotions, or to get along with others, or to handle conflict. This is also one of the reasons why it's so difficult to measure whether or not students have really learned SEL skills. Integrating SEL into the DNA of a school, I've mentioned this already, so I won't go over the details of it, but this is a major focus of the Institute, is how to integrate the science behind SEL, mindfulness, and character education into every part of the school. And then finally, the education of the adults. As mentioned before, this is one of the key challenges of the field. And one of the things I've heard CASEL founders mention is that they now realize that they should have started with the education of the adults first, rather than the curriculum. Because, to use the old adage, you can't teach what you don't know. Most teacher education programs don't cover SEL, but here and there programs are starting to pop up, places like San Jose State and University of Virginia. So I want to close this webinar with something that Carolyn Chase, an Austin, Texas administrator, said to me once. She said, sometimes it's hard for the adults to connect to the fact that students are human beings. So SEL is the humanity that's created when we do things like check-ins with each other, which allows us to have real relationships where you're really interested in somebody's story and you want to know what that person's about and why they are the way they are. I think this sums up what SEL and also mindfulness and character education are really all about. They remind us of our own humanity and of each other's humanity. So this ends the first webinar. We really thank you for listening and very much hope that this has given a good lay of the land for SEL. And we'd love to hear from you any lingering questions you might have, or if there's a part of the field that you think we missed or need to provide more information on. So next up is mindfulness in education. All right, thanks so much.